loss, shutdown, isolation, transition. My guest knows a lot about those subjects. In fact, she wrote an essay on the subjects, and it has been published in a best-selling anthology. Someday you might need this information, or maybe like me, you need it now. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Page One, the award-winning show for writers with the reader in mind.
That draws the reader along, just like fiction.
Here's your host and producer, Zita Christian.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I am delighted to introduce to you today a very special guest. Her name is Marianne Udel, and she has a book that you might find very interesting. I hope you don't need it now, but chances are that you will. So, Marianne, thank you very, very much for joining me. This is such a lovely coincidence about how we even came to meet each other. We have a mutual friend, Shrikant Joshi in Pune, India, who connected with you and saw what it was that you were writing about and said, "Oh, you should meet my friend Zita." And he told me about you, and here we are.
So, yes, I think the universe works in mysterious ways. We were destined to meet.
Yeah, I agree.
Somebody from India.
I know. So there's a lot of things I want to talk about today. And I want to focus most of the interview on your essay that's in the book. And then I want to talk about the writing and the writing process itself, because I know that a lot of the viewers of Page One are writers, and they appreciate hearing what it's like to get something published and, all of the process that goes into that. But let me first start with your piece in the anthology.
Okay.
So talk to me about the title of the anthology and the title of your essay.
Well, the book is called Unleashing Your Soul Level Magic.
Yes.
And my particular chapter is called From Grief to Purpose. When all of these stories were being collated, when the potential authors were all had to submit a proposal. And what do you want to write about? What do you want to say? I knew that it had to be about becoming a widow at the age of 24. I knew that that was the thing that really has changed my life in ways I never expected. There's the obvious things that people would connect to. Somebody dies. Yes, your life changed dramatically.
Yes.
At the age of 24, it was something that was totally unexpected.
For sure. I think because I've read your essay multiple times, and because this is Page One, I'd love it if you would read Page One and just, finish out the page on the next page so that the audience can get a feel for the flavor of your work, and especially for the subject matter itself, because I think you did a brilliant job of hooking the reader in right there at the beginning. If you'd share that with us, that would be great.
Thank you. I will. From Grief to Purpose by Marianne Udel. As I look back at the frightened young woman I was over 40 years ago, I never would have imagined that the healing work I do today would be a direct result of the devastating pain I felt when my husband Bob died. The morning after he was killed in an automobile crash, I was on an early morning flight from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Erie, PA to plan his funeral. Nothing made sense, and everything felt wrong. The first-class breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast made me cry. Breakfast was Bob's favorite meal. Luckily, I sat in the window seat and could stare out at the sunrise to hide my steady tears. After arriving at the Erie airport, my in-laws greeted me with their own sobs and pain. Bob's dad spoke about the things we had to do that day. visit the funeral home, pick out the burial plot, headstone and casket, write an obituary, pick out the clothes to bury him in, and plan the viewing and funeral. To be honest, a lot of it is a blur. I remember sobbing at Bob's casket and my dad gently guiding me away, keeping his protective arm around me. I remember the friends, acquaintances, and co-workers expressing their condolences and platitudes, which were supposed to comfort me, but just made me angry. It's better that he didn't have to suffer any longer. He's in a better place. It's a good thing we didn't have any children yet. At least I'm young and can still find someone else. I didn't want anyone else. I wanted Bob. Why did this have to happen? I didn't even get to say goodbye.
Thank you. Gosh, Marianne, clearly, that's a very emotional situation, obviously, to go through. It is also emotional to hear. Mm-hmm. And I thank you for writing about it so candidly and not shrinking from what the reality is. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, especially about that early time right after Bob was killed. Mm-hmm. One of the things you mentioned in the book is that it took you, you were staying with your in-laws for about a month before you went home. Right. And that when you got home, your mom came to stay with you for a while and help you. So I want to know two things. What was the reluctance to go home? And when your mom got there, what kind of help was she able to give?
Okay, well, part of the reluctance to actually go into the house was the fact that I had been out of town when Bob was killed. The flight from Minneapolis. I was doing a theater apprenticeship in Minnesota. We were going to move there. So we had agreed that he would stay and, get a little more experience in Erie, and I would start, laying the groundwork for a life in Minnesota. And I had not been to the house for about a month. Weeks. I just weeks into my apprenticeship in Minnesota. And the only time I had been in the house was with him. And I knew that all of his things were still there. His clothes, his cameras, his typewriter. In fact, there was a letter in the typewriter that he was writing to me. And I knew that the memories would come flooding, and I didn't think I could do it by myself. So I asked my mom for the emotional support. And she helped me clean up what I wanted to clean up. She made sure I was eating. But mostly it was just to have a physical person with me in the house. Yeah. We didn't necessarily have to say or do anything. There was nothing that we could fix. It was a situation that was beyond fixing, but it was just making sure that I was doing what I needed to do to stay healthy. We would go out for a walk, perhaps, mm-hmm. and just have meals togetger, and just cry.
Yeah, exactly, and just cry. I'm thinking about my own experience that I went through with when Dick died, and there's certain things that you need to put away, the physical things, and certainly that can be helpful. Having my daughter here to help me was, made some of that awful chore. I'm not saying it made it easier, but it helped me get through it. Mm-hmm. But then there comes the time when there are other things that need to be put away. And I think of those as the dreams of the future. And that takes time. But what I learned, and I learned through the hospice organization that helped me, when Dick was dying, that it's good to wait about 6 months before starting a bereavement group, because in that first 6 months, you're just in so much shock. Everything is just, here's a task that has to be done, an insurance thing, a banking thing, just so much of that administrative work, and the physical things of, putting things away and donating if you feel ready to do that. But that whole idea of putting away the dreams of the future and what you thought your future was going to be like, that's a whole nother step.
Yeah.
So could you talk to me about, um, did you join a bereavement group? And if you did, how did it help?
Well, back in the early 80s, there weren't any bereavement groups for
Uh-oh.
young widows. There was no internet, there was no social media. I There was nothing at the church. Any grief groups or widow groups were women that were my grandmother's age.
Oh my. Of course. And you're 24 when that
Yes.
happened.
So um, I remember before my second marriage, I started seeing a therapist. And I remember having read a newspaper article that was about helping widows of veterans, young widows. And I thought, "Oh, I wish I had had that."
Yeah.
So, and actually, it was the therapist that said, "Oh, you probably wish you had had that kind of support." I said, "Yes, yes, of course," because not having someone to talk to who understands. I have since been able to communicate with different grief organizations because of the work that I do. And there's one that is specifically dedicated to widows and widowers. And they even have camps
Wow.
in different parts of the United States where everybody who comes is a widow or a widower or the child of a widow or a widower. And they organize these camps so that you have people to talk to who understand. They're not trying to fix you. They are not trying to placate you or make you feel better. They just know how much it hurts.
And you don't have to explain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's just a shorthand in speaking. You say, "Oh, did you go? Oh, yes. Oh my God, I'm so sorry." And you want to talk about it.
A friend of mine, noted astrologer, Caroline Casey, she would
Mhm.
often say that when you have undergone some truly traumatic
Mhm.
situation, like having the death of a spouse, she said it's like having your passport to life stamped with a visa to the underworld. And
Mm.
other people who have that same visa, you recognize it in each other. There's something in that energy, and you're drawn to each other because you both know that you've been through a certain ordeal, and there is an emotional camaraderie that comes from that. So I can see why being able to attend a camp where everybody understands, even though the circumstances, are obviously different, but still everybody understands that particular trauma.
Right. And the thing about that, specifically about the camp, is that it can be something that just happened in the near future or something that happened 10 years ago. Whatever it is, you don't really get over a loss like that.
No, you don't.
You learn how to live with it. And anybody who has gone through it understands it in their soul. So there's just that unspoken awareness and knowing.
I get that. And I keep reminding myself that while I was just shy of my 75th birthday when Dick died, you were only 24.
Mhm.
You had this whole life ahead of you and
Mhm.
no role models to to go to. And I want you to, if you will, tell me the story about how your mother-in-law suggested, you with the television background, the theater degree, your mother-in-law suggests that you take a job as a waitress at a particular restaurant. Could you tell me about that?
Yes. Well, I really had nothing to do because I was, the apprenticeship in Minnesota was over. I was not going to go back to that at all. It didn't make
Yeah.
sense anymore. I was pretty much sitting around my house, and my mother-in-law knew that it would be helpful for me to get busy. All through college, I had worked as a waitress during the summers. And there was a new restaurant that was opening up just down the street from where I lived. I wouldn't have to drive anywhere. I could walk. And she knew the owner. He went to her church. So when they had a conversation at church, oh, I'm opening my little diner, and I need waitresses. Oh, my daughter-in-law would be perfect. And so
she needs to get out of the house.
Yes,
Yep.
they decided right away. And she's a widow. Oh, I got yeah, because the other woman that worked, the other waitress that worked the breakfast and lunch shift, was a widow herself.
Mm.
She was somebody who raised 2 children after her husband died. She was a motherly figure who could talk to me about what it was like being a widow. She was an example of living beyond the pain, having a life in spite of losing a spouse. So she was the angel that gave me hope that I could be happy.
So she did talk with you about all of those,
we didn't have
the nitty gritty.
Right. We didn't go out to have drinks or anything like that. It would be a slow time in the restaurant, or when we were getting ready, finishing cleaning up. And and she says, I know it's hard, honey. I even really know. And then she would tell me a story about what it was like raising her kids. And then she would reprimand some guys who were getting too fresh when she knew they were married, and leave her alone. She's sensitive right now. So she was a protector and a guide, and just moral support.
I have a neighbor. Her name is Helen. She's a little bit older than I am, and she's been widowed for almost 19 years. And I sit on her deck often, and we talk. And sometimes it's a conversation and sharing different experiences and plans. And sometimes I just sit there and cry. And that's what it was like the last time I was at her house a couple of weeks ago. And I remember she just reached over and said, just keep living until you feel alive again. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly what I need to do. Just keep living until I feel alive again.
That's beautiful.
So I want to get into the personal transition aspect, because what you've done with your experience is, a website devoted to coaching people through all of this kind of trauma. But before we get to that, I want to know a little bit more about the actual transition that you went through. And one of the things you talked about, I experienced it too, but not when Dick died. I experienced it earlier because he had Alzheimer's. And so for quite a few years before the pandemic, we wound up isolating just, for things related to the disease. But in your essay, you say, friends know you only as half a couple. So could you tell us a little about that and how you moved on from that? Because that's another loss.
uh, that's one of those secondary losses that you end up experiencing. Because Bob and I met in college and we married a year after we had graduated, everybody we knew knew Marianne and Bob,
Yeah.
or Bob and Marianne. And, we went to everybody else's weddings and they came to ours and out to dinner and shows and whatever it is we did socializing. But everybody knew us as a couple. And, I tried a couple of times just spending time by myself after Bob had died. And it just was really hard. I didn't know how to behave. They didn't know how to behave. And it was painful. It hurt. Everyone it was too awkward. And I just started talking to Bob. Whenever I would walk, I would say, honey, I don't know what to do. So, and I was not crazy. I just, I was like, that's a normal thing. You talk to
Yes.
whoever it is that's gone.
Yeah, it is.
And it's very comforting. And it was on one of those walks where I decided that I would leave. I knew that I had talked about, he and I had talked about moving to New York City. And that's how we decided on Minneapolis. I know it doesn't seem the same, but the reason we were going to Minneapolis was because of culture. There was theater, there was art, there was television stations, and it was a smaller cultural hub than New York City. Now I could sell the house and move to New York. There was nothing that was really stopping me from going in that direction now. I could continue to pursue my acting career. So I put the house up for sale. First I got accepted at a theater in New Jersey. I could do summer stock at a theater in New Jersey. I got to meet people who lived in New York. It was an hour outside of the city, and eventually ended up living there for 10 years. That's where I met my current husband.
So, I want to ask you about that, because one of the things that you mentioned in the essay was how the dating scene was such a disaster. And at 24, the idea of dating is certainly going to be something that you could easily see in your future. And yet I know for a lot of people today as well, it can be a disaster. Excuse me. But you mentioned specifically that when you met Jim, who then became your second husband, you talked about the first date, and you said that Jim, on that first date, asked you about Bob. So tell me why that question was so important to building the relationship that you wound up having with Jim.
Well, everyone else I dated really didn't know I was a widow until I told them. And they were appalled. They were scared. They didn't know how to behave. They assumed I was looking for a replacement. It got weird after I said that. Jim was the first one who wanted to hear more about Bob, and he knew that that's part of what made me who I am. And if he wanted to have a relationship with me, he needed to know about the relationship with Bob as well. And he even joked, well, who's going to get you in heaven? So, but, having the empathy and having the understanding that you can't negate that from my life. It's part of who I am, and it's part of what makes me me. So he said, okay, just tell me what he was like. And there were a lot of things that were very similar about the two of them. So maybe it was Bob that brought us together on that street in New York City when we met.
Could well be. So tell me then, because because of our age differences at the time when we were widowed, your path is your path was vastly different
Mhm.
than what the path I'm discovering now. I can't imagine taking off my wedding rings. That is not in my future ever.
Mhm.
But you were a young woman.
Mhm.
Talk to me about when you made that decision and what was that like?
Well, I put it on the other hand to start out.
Mm-hmm.
And then after uh, Jim and I got married, I wore all the rings.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So it looked like I had just this fantastic multi ring, as I said. Um, and then my finger got too big for the rings, so I have it in my jewelry box now. And otherwise, the circulation would have
Yeah,
been cut off in my finger.
yeah.
So, but it the choice was to just shift from my left hand to my right hand.
I also want to mention for the people in the viewing audience, I know that you have a free download on your website that is about 7 days of affirmations
Mhm.
to help people get through this. And so we'll have all of that, information available for people also. But I want to get into the writing experience
Mhm.
because what you have is an essay that is collected with other essays in an anthology. You're one of 12 in this anthology. Did you have to, you said a little bit about this at the beginning, but I want to know more. Did you have to audition in some way? Not, I don't mean for the quality of the writing, but to see if your subject, if your story fit
Mhm.
with what the publisher planned.
Well, the publisher had an idea of what the types of stories that she wanted to collect. So I was on her mailing list. She and I were already colleagues, and she said, "I have an application process, so please fill that out and write a little bit about what you would like to share if you would become part of this book."
Mhm.
And I said, "Well, I kind of think this might work." I had doubts.
Yeah.
So, but she said, "Oh my goodness, yes." And uh, I was nervous. I wasn't ready to write a whole book, but I
Mhm.
felt that I could write a chapter. I said, "Yes, I can do that." It's one more stepping stone towards writing a
Yeah.
full-fledged solo book. Um,
And your essay, though, the title of your essay, From Grief to Purpose, I mean, that there's an arc there that is so filled with hope.
that was the last thing that I came up with. I wrote all of the stuff, and then the publisher helped me come up with the title.
So I've got one more question. The whole subject about grief, and you talk about needing more awareness, more acceptance, more publicity, more understanding, and I agree with you. So the question is, would you participate in another anthology about grief? I mean, do you feel that you have more to say now that you have had distance from the incident?
Oh, there's always more to say.
Yeah.
We don't have enough discussion about it, and we have to talk about it.
I agree. I definitely agree. We'll definitely be talking about that. I want to let people in the audience know that the interview that I'm going to be doing after this is with Corey Wamsley, who is the publisher of Aurora Borealis. That's the publishing company, and that's the company that published the anthology. So we'll learn more about that whole part of the experience when I get to talk with her. In the meantime, though, Marianne, I want to thank you very, very much for being a guest on Page One. I also want to thank our mutual friend in India, Shrikant Joshi, and just for connecting the two of us. And this is Page One. I love to close this show with a quote from the fantasy writer, the late fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin, who said, "There have been civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories." So find your story, find a way to tell it, and join me again next time. Thank you.